British political theory rested on two pretty complicated ideas. These were known as republicanism and liberalism. Now, before you start thinking of Democrats and Republicans, get that idea right out of your head, because that would be wrong. The British were not thinking of republicanism and liberalism in the way that we think of it today. Instead, they had an entirely different definition. So let's dive into that right now. Republicanism referred to this idea that only economically independent or wealthy people would have enough virtue to be able to govern well. So, what does it mean to be economically independent? Well, for them, the idea was that you were not dependent upon anyone else for your income. So in today's language, somebody who's an entrepreneur would be economically independent because they make their own money. Somebody who shows up at work and works for a boss and gets a paycheck at the end of the month would not be economically independent. Back then, in 18th century Britain, economically independent primarily meant that you had inherited your wealth. You didn't have to work for it. It also meant that you were a landowner. So, why did they believe that people who are wealthy and people who own land would be more capable of acting virtuously and exercising freedom? Well, it has to do with what goes on with politicians and their constituents. For most politicians, their constituents are constantly begging them to vote a certain way. If you are economically dependent upon the person who's begging you to vote a certain way, you're most likely going to cave into their demands because you need their money. However, if you're not economically dependent upon them, if you're one of the wealthy, the people who already have money without having that constituent do anything on your behalf, then you're more likely to turn the hand at them, which in the British eyes means that you are more objective or disinterested, that you are going to vote based on principles and virtue instead of just because of economics and greed. So, as Benjamin Franklin so wisely put it, he says, a virtuous people, and only a virtuous people, are capable of exercising freedom. And when he said that, what he meant was that only the wealthy have enough virtue to truly exercise freedom in an appropriate way. So that's republicanism. But what about liberalism? This doesn't mean progressive politics in the way we think of it. In fact, liberalism that we're talking about now was actually coined by John Locke. He wrote a book in the 1680s called Two Treatises of Government. And this book very quickly became popular, both in England and in the American colonies. And in this book, John Locke espouses what is called the social contract theory. According to the social contract theory of government, government is actually a contract between the individuals in the government, in the country, and between the government itself. And within this contract, people surrender their individual rights to the government in exchange for the government protecting our natural rights. So, how does that work? What does that actually look like? Well, let's just use a common example from today of how we have surrendered our individual rights. Let's say you're late for school. You might want to drive 80 miles an hour down the highway in order to get to school on time, but you've actually surrendered that right. In fact, the minute you begin to drive fast, what you'll notice is that the government has put a speed limit sign in your way. As citizens, we have surrendered that individual right, the right to drive as fast as we want, but we do so that the government can protect a natural right of life for every citizen in America. And so, that's how social contract theory works. We surrender individual rights, government protects natural rights, and those natural rights are life, liberty, and, according to John Locke, property. Now, we might be more familiar with the phrase pursuit of happiness because that's what Americans are going to use later on. But ultimately, life, liberty, and property are protected by the government, and we give them that freedom to do so by surrendering our individual rights. Now, these notions might sound pretty familiar to you because they show up in our Declaration of Independence. In fact, what we're going to see is that the colonists are going to embrace these political theories. And why shouldn't they? They were British. They're going to embrace these British political theories, but then something interesting happens. The colonists are actually going to use these British political theories to justify breaking away from Britain later on. So here's what we've got to question. How do we get from such diverse colonies that can't stop fighting with each other, that really seem to have nothing in common at all, to all of a sudden, by the into the 1700s, colonies that have now embraced this common identity, that have joined together and united as one to break away from Britain? In other words, how in the world did such diverse colonies become American?